Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into the totally absurd, fascinating, and roughly 5,000-year history of why humans have killed, died, and built massive global empires for what is essentially just a shiny rock in the ground. I mean, think about it. For over 5 millennia, humanity has been completely obsessed. Explorers literally crossed uncharted, super dangerous oceans for it, kingdoms waged brutal wars over it, and even today, governments are still hoarding it in these massive underground vaults. But what's actually going on here? It's kind of a fundamental mystery when you really stop to think about it. I mean, look at human history. We've covered practically everything in this stuff. We slap it on our buildings, we drape it around our necks, we cast giant statues out of it. We are collectively losing our minds over this specific yellow metal. But why? Is it just because everyone simply agrees it has value? Well, that sounds almost completely ridiculous on the surface, right? So to really understand this, we need to strip away the fancy jewelry and the statues and look at the underlying mechanics of value itself. Which brings us to Section 1, the perfect money, the science and psychology of value. All right, so let's dive right in. To figure this out, we have to look at what actually makes something functional as money in the first place. You see, for anything to work as a medium of exchange, it can't just look pretty. It has to satisfy a very strict set of rules, both economically and psychologically. And the absolute rule number one, it must be rare. If you can just make an infinite amount of it out of thin air, boom, it becomes worthless overnight. Imagine a baker suddenly demanding 50 coins for a loaf of bread just because the metal became as common as dirt. Now gold, it forms incredibly deep underground over millions of years. We can't just synthesize it. And luckily for human economics, alchemy, that medieval attempt to turn cheap lead into gold, turned out to be complete nonsense. Because nobody could crack the code to mass produce it in a lab, gold stayed incredibly rare. That geological scarcity, that is the absolute bedrock of its value. But beyond just being extremely rare, gold happens to possess these weirdly perfect physical properties that make it the ultimate enduring asset. Listen to this. It doesn't rust, it doesn't decay over time, it is incredibly easy to recognize, and you can melt it down and divide it perfectly into smaller pieces for trade without losing the actual material. Plus, on top of all those highly functional economic traits, it seamlessly satisfies this deeply ingrained human biological obsession with shiny things. It's honestly the perfect storm of chemistry and psychology. Moving on to Section 2, Empires and Rushes, the March of Gold Through History. So, once our ancestors figured out how perfect this metal was, the entire trajectory of civilization completely changed. This timeline maps out a massive historical journey. It kicks off around 3000 BC, when ancient civilizations like the Egyptians first discovered gold sparkling in rivers and underground mines. From there, it really evolved. Fast forward to 600 BC, and the Kingdom of Lydia, over in modern-day Turkey, revolutionized trade by creating the first standardized stamped coins. So no more weighing random chunks of metal, you just traded the coin. And then, skipping ahead to 1848, we see this ancient obsession spark a literal frenzy in the American West. The evolution here is just incredible. Going from being viewed as the sacred flesh of the sun god to a standardized tool of ancient commerce, all the way to becoming the driving force behind modern Western expansion. Now, to really wrap your head around the sheer scale of this ancient obsession, consider this staggering number, 240. When archaeologists finally cracked open King Tutankhamun's tomb back in 1922, they discovered that his coffin alone, just the coffin, contained over 240 pounds of solid gold. The ancient Egyptians quite literally believed gold was the flesh of the gods, so burying a teenage pharaoh in that much gold, an amount that could buy you multiple sprawling mansions in today's dollars, by the way, was basically a way of securing eternal status. They wanted gold on their thrones, their crowns, and well, they're dead. But let's look at what happens when an empire's ambition outgrows its gold supply. Take Rome, for example. When Julius Caesar conquered new territories like Gaul, he didn't just want the land. He wanted the massive amounts of gold he needed to pay his soldiers in coins, which were called aurae. But they ran into a massive problem. Even mighty Rome couldn't conquer enough new gold mines to keep up with their rapidly expanding army. So what did they do? They actually invented ancient inflation. They slowly started shrinking the amount of real gold in their coins, secretly mixing in cheaper metals. This sneaky process, known as debasement, was a desperate trick to stretch their wealth. And honestly, it's a trap governments still fall into today. By the 1400s, rumors of literal cities of gold in the Americas sent European explorers sailing across the Atlantic, resulting in a completely tragic cultural clash. You see, the Aztecs and Incas had enormous amounts of gold, but they didn't actually use it as money. To them, it was priceless spiritual art. It represented their gods and their ancestors. But the Spanish conquistadors, they saw it strictly as cold, hard wealth. They quite literally looked at these incredibly sacred artifacts, melted them all down into solid blocks, and shipped them right back to Europe. It was absolutely one of the largest and most destructive wealth transfers in all of human history. Centuries later, that exact same fever struck a completely new continent. By 1848, a guy named James Marshall spotted something shiny at a sawmill in California. And man, that discovery triggered absolute madness. Over 300,000 people abandoned their jobs, their homes, and honestly, their common sense to flood into California as 49ers. They all wanted to get rich overnight. Now, most of them failed miserably, but there's a really fascinating bit of historical irony here. The first verified millionaire of the California gold rush, he wasn't a miner at all. He was just a super savvy businessman who started selling shovels and pickaxes to those desperate miners at 10 times the normal price. Talk about hitting the nail on the head. Which leads us to Section 3, the Gold Standard Era, the rise and fall of paper trust. Eventually, as the modern world took shape, governments realized they had to somehow control this wild madness. I mean, the global economy was just getting way too complex for everyone to walk around carrying heavy bags of metal. And that brings us to the Gold Standard Era, a brilliant, albeit temporary solution to manage human greed. The core idea of the gold standard was simple. Every single paper dollar was theoretically backed by physical metals sitting safe in a bank vault. It kept governments disciplined. But wow, look how quickly that discipline broke down under pressure. Step 1, World War I hits. Wars are insanely expensive, and governments just didn't have enough gold. So they simply ignored the rules, fired up the printers, and created massive amounts of unbacked paper money to fund the fighting, causing inflation to just explode. Step 2, the Great Depression follows, and in 1933, President Franklin D. Roosevelt actually makes private gold ownership illegal. He forced U.S. citizens to hand their gold over to the government in exchange for paper. Finally, Step 3, in 1971, President Richard Nixon delivered the absolute final blow, officially ending the dollar's convertibility into gold entirely. Really think about the sheer magnitude of that decision. When Nixon severed that tie, for the first time in thousands of years, global money became pure trust. The government basically looked at the public and said, hey, just trust us. This unbacked piece of paper still has value simply because we say it does. And rather surprisingly, the majority of the world just went along with it. But a lot of very observant people didn't trust that new system at all. They saw the writing on the wall. They decided to buy physical gold instead of holding on to paper dollars. And boy, were they massively rewarded for their skepticism. After the gold standard was killed in 1971, the price of gold absolutely exploded. It shot up from $35 an ounce to over $850 by 1980. That is a staggering 24 times increase in less than a decade. The folks who held on to the shiny rock generated massive wealth as paper money rapidly lost its purchasing power. All of this brings us to our final part, Section 4, the ultimate survivor, the quiet hoarders. So here is the ultimate brilliant irony of our modern financial system, what we like to call the 2020 paradox. We're off the gold standard, right? Paper money rules the world. Or does it? Well, during the recent pandemic, global governments went absolutely feral, injecting trillions upon trillions of newly printed paper dollars into the economy to keep things afloat. But at the exact same time, central banks in places like China, Russia, India, and yes, even the United States, with its thousands of tons sitting in Fort Knox, were quietly hoarding huge amounts of physical gold. They never sold off their base layer of wealth. If paper money is really so reliable, you kind of have to ask yourself, why are the central banks quietly stacking gold bars in the background? The answer is historical precedent. The track record of human ambition really speaks for itself here. Rome shrank its coins and eventually collapsed. Spain extracted mountains of wealth and its empire collapsed. The mighty British Empire slowly faded away. Through all of it, through literally every war, every failed currency, every single hyperinflation event, gold survived. For over 5 millennia, humanity has consistently trusted this metal more than almost anything else on planet Earth. Which perfectly sets up this quote from the famous banker J.P. Morgan back in 1912. He was testifying before Congress and he stated, very simply, gold is money, everything else is credit. He perfectly summed up humanity's 5,000-year history in just 8 words.
He was reminding us that despite all of our incredibly complex modern financial inventions, the credit cards, the digital banking, the unbacked fiat currencies, gold remains the absolute base reality of the financial world. It is the ultimate settler of debts.
So, that brings us to the end of our journey today, and I really want to leave you with this final thought. As you watch global debt climb, and as the central bank money printers continue to run faster than ever before in human history, you have to ask yourself a serious question about your own wealth. When push finally comes to shove and the system is truly tested, will you put your trust in a piece of paper or the shiny rock? Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.